Good morning, everyone. My name is Bruce Lynn. I'm one of the managing partners of the Financial Executives Consulting Group. We're going to start the main body of our presentation in just a moment or so. I want to give everyone a chance to log on. For those of you who are logged on, please note that you are in mute-only mode, which means that you can hear me, but I cannot hear you. So if you have questions during the formal part of this presentation, please type them into the question box on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and we'll take them after the presentation is over. I'm going to be reading the questions out loud, so if there are questions that you want to ask that are of proprietary nature, you can email me and we could take them offline. And if we don't get to all the questions, since you've typed them in, we will definitely take them offline. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go away here for a minute or so, let other people log on, and we'll start in the next 2 minutes or so. Good morning, everyone. For those of you who have just logged on, my name is Bruce Lynn. I'm one of the managing partners of the Financial Executives Consulting Group. We're going to start the main body of our presentation, how to build a cyber healthy organization, in just another moment. This presentation is brought to you in conjunction with FENG and ExecHQ. As you might have read in the papers, cybersecurity is certainly a focus for many companies. So we thought we would address that through today's presentation. For those of you who have just logged on, you are in mute-only mode. So you can hear me, but I can't hear you. So if you have questions, please type them into the question box on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to them after the main body of the presentation. I'll be reading out questions, so if you don't want me to read out your question, you can send it to me by email, and we'll take it offline. And for questions that we may not get to, not to worry, because you've typed them in, and we will get to them offline. You can expect a link to the video. So if you have to leave before it's over, you can see how this ends, and you will get a copy of the presentation in the next day or so. So with that, I am going to turn the presentation over to Tim Harp. So Tim, why don't you introduce yourself and take it away?
Good morning. My name is Tim Harp. I'm a principal at ExecHQ, retired naval officer, also retired from the senior executive service where I held several high-level positions working with cybersecurity in both the U.S. Department of Defense and NATO. So this morning, I'd like to help clarify where cybersecurity is today and the importance of cybersecurity governance as a concept. Cybersecurity today is a growth business. The cybercrime nation revenues are estimated to be about the size of the United Kingdom, over $2 trillion per year. Global cyber intrusions threatening organizational cybersecurity grew 400% in 2019 and 2020 combined. This is a reminder of the growing cybersecurity risk that we all need to manage, because it's only a matter of time before each of us is attacked, and many of us may have already been attacked without our knowledge. We hear about ransomware, malware, identity theft, and other cyber incidents. Ransomware is malicious software that blocks access to your systems and data until a ransom's paid. Malware is software designed to disrupt, damage, or gain unauthorized access to a system. Either presents significant risk because they can result in identity theft, process disruption, or theft of corporate trade secrets, essential to maintaining a competitive edge. They may seem abstract as presented in the news, because they affect someone else, but they have one thing in common. More and more, they are targeting individuals as opposed to attacking the traditional defense mechanisms. From an enterprise perspective, cybersecurity governance expands the traditional defense mechanisms to the larger cyber attack surface, which includes everything. It's now a critical component of the enterprise risk management that involves the entire enterprise. Those of us who've been working with information technology for a while remember when cyber defense was simply a matter of getting the right antivirus software and then depending on the IT team to establish firewalls, whatever that meant. They established a fixed defense sufficient for the time, and we were all comfortable that we avoided the cyber risk. We, as leaders and users, didn't need to give it too much thought. It was an effective tactical defense mechanism, but now we're learning that we need something more strategic. I'm a firm believer in taking lessons from history. I generally like to tie today's challenges to lessons in history wherever possible to add context. In this case, I'll use an example from when I lived in Brussels for 8 years. One of my favorite places to visit was about a 2-hour drive away in France. There's a section of the Maginot Line that is maintained by a group of volunteers and funded through donations. Visitors can ride in a small gauge train for about a mile into a mountain and see all the support systems and a working gun turret. But let me back up a bit for those not familiar with the Maginot Line. It was an almost 300-mile-long system of bunkers connected by tunnels. At some points, it was 16 miles wide. It was built in the 1930s, and in its heyday, it housed 500,000 troops and support staff who lived and worked underground in the Maginot Line to protect France from direct invasion from Germany. It ultimately was proven effective in that the Germans never breached the line, but they did come through Belgium to circumvent the fortifications. So history lesson number 1 that you hear most often is that a fixed defense can only be temporary. Eventually, a determined adversary will find a way around it. That's how the Maginot Line is most often thought of or referred to. However, there's a second lesson based on the French strategy, which was to delay the Germans by forcing them to either slug through the robust defense of the Maginot Line or go around it. In either case, the delay would be long enough for the French to call up their reserves. And if they could only force Germany to go through, if they could actually force Germany to go through neutral Belgium, not only would it buy time, but it would also bring the British into the conflict based on the treaties they had with Belgium. That aspect of the strategy worked. However, the French were defeated soundly, not because of the Maginot Line or the strategy, but because they failed to execute the strategy effectively by investing in the adequate training of the reserves so they could fight effectively. In spite of a sound strategy and superior numbers, by the way, I need the first slide. The French were defeated in a matter of days. That is the second lesson. Next slide, please. That is the second lesson. If your strategy includes a reserve force, you need to invest in training those reserves so that they are as effective as the regular troops. Now, I'm not going to address the slides and read the slides to you, and because I figure you can read them yourselves, but I'm going to hit all those points as I go through my discussion. Cybersecurity is similar to this Maginot Line theory in that you can invest heavily in a technology solution to shore up your physical defense, but still lose. You can have a great strategy to engage all stakeholders, similar to training for the reserves, but you don't govern the entire effort effectively to train and monitor the stakeholders, you will lose. This is why cybersecurity is so important. The governance is key to minimizing the overall cyber risk, to invest in the technical solution, establishing the line, and ensure the enterprise is properly trained and equipped to deal with the cyber threat, in essence, training the reserves. Cybersecurity is now and will continue to be what is called an advanced persistent threat, requiring coordinated active defense. So what's driving this? It's an advanced threat because cybercrime is at the leading edge of technology, and it's persistent because there's a low-cost barrier to enter. Anyone with access to the internet and basic skills can enter the game, and it has a potentially high payoff. There's nothing in sight that will change these conditions. An active defense is needed because the threat is always evolving as the adversaries find new and innovative ways to attack. The adversaries can be anyone, but we also see it's an easy way for nation states with limited resources that may be non-competitive in traditional warfare capabilities to try to become a player on the world stage. North Korea and Iraq are examples of nations in this category. Their attacks most often avoid the wall and attack the reserves. It's the best weapon they have against larger adversaries who depend upon information technology for their economies and their military capabilities. As an example of this, sort of in reverse, in NATO, we established a cyber center of excellence in Estonia for exactly this reason. They don't have the resources to contribute significantly to the NATO alliance defense posture in a traditional sense, but they do have enough resources for cyber. And with this contribution, they can punch above their weight in the alliance. At one point, Russia had used a cyber attack and took control of Estonia's networks, basically shut down the country, causing significant disruption. Since that time, Estonia has been motivated to take cybersecurity very seriously, so it was a natural fit for them to take over this role in NATO. NATO's established a center of excellence in Estonia that is now world-class and is a valuable asset to all the NATO nations, including the US. So in cyber, relatively small investments can have a large effect, both offensively, as in Iraq and North Korea, and defensively, as in Estonia. On the other hand, Russia, China, and other peer competitors are robustly funding efforts to use cyber attacks to disrupt our economy and our democracy, as well as to harvest industrial secrets to enhance their industry competitive posture, adding yet another dimension to the threat. These attacks are robustly funded and can be aimed at either the wall or the reserves. So attacks will come from small and large sources. Many may be small and targeted, or they could be complex and sophisticated. We no longer have the luxury of simply building a wall for cyber defense. Cybersecurity can no longer be left only to the IT team. The entire enterprise is at risk, and effective governance is required. So what does governance mean? Proper governance runs from the board through the internal and external enterprise, the supply chain, customers, and anyone else who touches the corporate information or systems. Advanced technology solutions and a solid architecture are still needed to maintain barriers against technology intrusions so that the enterprise has an effective wall. As important, the rest of the enterprise needs to be involved to ensure the reserves are trained to avoid a Maginot Line type strategic failure. The reserves in this case, of course, are both within the enterprise and with external partners. Continuous communications, training, monitoring, which includes active measures like penetration tests, and feedback to enable adjustments over time, are all needed to enable proper active cybersecurity governance. Could I have the next slide, please? So the question becomes how to set up an effective cybersecurity governance structure. I'll begin with a few principles that have proven effective. First, cybersecurity has to clearly come from the top. It's no longer sufficient to have cybersecurity buried in a risk management committee or in the IT department. It needs to be on every agenda, at every board meeting, or in enterprises with no board, the top leadership all needs to be actively engaged. It's like the change management folks always have said about the difference between effective change management and failed change management. Success is highly correlated with clear top-down priorities. Cybersecurity won't be effective unless everyone understands it to be a priority and there's a clear governance structure to ensure it's both effective and persistent. A robust physical architecture has to be adequately developed, maintained, and continuously funded. There isn't a cookie-cutter solution here. The physical architecture needs to be tailored to the enterprise and the level of risk that the board is willing to assume. The different types of cyber risks need to be managed in a way that everyone has visibility and understands potential impacts. And the governance folks need to communicate effectively with the operational folks to make sure that they're working to the same objectives. So this presents a challenge to establish communications across informal organizational boundaries that may exist within the culture. This in itself could prove to be significant, and hence, again, the need for clear vision and purpose from the top. Everyone who touches a network needs to become aware and actively support cybersecurity efforts. The nature of this advanced, persistent threat is that the weakest link will be targeted. The weakest link could be anyone, from the CEO to someone working as part-time security guard. It transcends all the structure. The objective needs to be to make cybersecurity a natural part of the environment for everyone, both internal and external to the organization. Strong security safeguards, combined with a culture of strong practices that incorporate a risk-based approach, appropriate investment, and continuous review in relation to business outcomes are key. Cybersecurity governance needs to be active, pervasive, persistent, and driven from the top. Could I have the next slide, please? So there are several frameworks and lots of different approaches to cybersecurity. As I said before, it needs to be defined at each enterprise based upon their own structure and their own determinations as to what an acceptable level of risk is. This slide is up just to show, not to go through it line by line, but to provide perspective into the complexity of the challenge. It is but one way to approach the challenge. Most organizations will have some or all of the activities listed here already in place. And it's just a matter of establishing a governance structure that can identify the strengths and weaknesses across the spectrum of the activities, define the acceptable level of risk, and adjust as required. So with that, I thank you, and I'll turn it over to Jeff, and I look forward to your questions at the end. Thanks.
Thank you, Tim. This is Jeff Kabaki, and I have been a Chief Information Officer at 5 different companies throughout my career, and have had the good pleasure of also then being responsible for cybersecurity. And so across those variety of different companies, I thought it would be good to share some of the best practices that we had put in place to make sure that we had a cyber healthy company. And I think the important point here is it doesn't matter what size company and whether you're public or private, 10 billion or 500 million, the best practices that I'm going to walk through apply to all of us. And much like Tim, I'm going to share a couple of stories along the way versus obviously just reading what's on the slide. And so it all starts really with the threat landscape. And this is something that is unique, as Tim was talking about, is unique to every firm. And so the best place to start is to understand what your threat landscape looks like. And this was something I had the FBI prepare for me a while back in terms of the threat actors, the vectors that they use to get into your company, and exactly why they would want to do that. So when I was the CIO of an aerospace and defense company that made rocket motors for the space shuttle and nuclear missiles and other things, the threat actors were really nation states, right? They wanted our intellectual property and did everything they could to get after what was considered unclassified information. And they used a variety of different vectors to help us, or to help them do that. And as I've been talking with others, they only had to be right once when they were hacking in and trying to get access to our systems. We had to be right every day. And so it took a set of policies and people and tools to help, keep the bad guys away. Now, what was interesting these days, of course, is the threat actors can be criminals. Most of the time on ransomware attacks, it's generally they're trying to get after some money, so they're going to hold your systems hostage until you either pay the ransom, and generally that's what companies have been doing. And it's a reasonable amount. They don't try to charge you millions and millions and millions of dollars because they want you to pay the ransom, and then they go after the next company and the next company. In the part of the supply chain, when I was the CIO of Winnebago Industries, so it's making RVs, travel trailers, etc., you wouldn't think that security would be as important there as it was, let's say, at an aerospace and defense company or Westinghouse Electric when I was the CIO there. But there was still in the supply chain cases where some of our suppliers were held ransom because they had a weak link in their network. They ended up having to shut down manufacturing for almost a week as they remediated the problems that came up as a result of the ransomware attack. And sometimes it's just bragging rights, that a certain individual or a group of individuals was able to target XYZ company and hold them hostage or steal their intellectual property. So again, the important thing is to start with, well, what does your threat landscape look like? And so when you think about that, you're naturally, I would think, thinking about risk management, et cetera. So when you look at the best practices, again, for a cyber healthy company, there's really 3 areas that I like to focus on, and people, are really the most important line of defense. And so it's important to continue to educate them to look at an inbound email with a PDF attachment as an example, and rather than just double click and open the PDF file, which then can, make bad things happen to your network, is say, that just doesn't look right. I'm going to have someone take a look at this before I just go ahead and open it up. In the policy section, you'll have an information security policy, an acceptable use policy, those types of things, just to make sure that people understand what their responsibilities are from a cybersecurity perspective. And of course, from a technology perspective, there are tons of tools these days to help in all aspects of cybersecurity. What's important is and I'll show a few tools coming up here in a couple slides, but what's important is that you look at it from a risk perspective and the threat landscape perspective and get some help in understanding, well, what's the best tool set for us? A good benchmark is is to spend about 5.5% to 6% of your total IT spend, should be going to cybersecurity. So it's a pretty significant piece of your overall budget. But a story on the people side, I was working for a company that I think almost every employee in the company received an email that looked exactly like it was coming from the company, right? And it said, happy holidays, click on the link to accept your, holiday gift. And Upon further review, and so 16 people out of many, 16 people who were very bright individuals ended up clicking on the link because it's told them to do that. They entered their username and password, and now the bad guy had their network credentials to be able to sign on as that individual. And so there were a couple things wrong with that. A, we never handed out holiday gifts, so that should have been the first red warning sign. And then secondly, upon further review, there were actually misspelled words, in the email. So upon further review, if you looked at it carefully, it clearly wasn't coming from the company, nor would we ever ask you to enter your username and password. So there were like 3 or 4 different red and yellow lights there, but we did have 16 people that clicked on that link, and then IT got involved and make sure that we restored their credentials and kicked the bad guys out. But so it can happen to, certainly can happen to anyone. But one of the things that I have found to be a very positive thing, and it resonates well with boards and management teams, is to really establish where you are from a baseline perspective. And there's several different frameworks out there. I like the ISO 27001 framework. It ties in nicely with SOX if that's something that your company has to adhere to. There are plenty of controls in place, much like you would have from a SOX controls perspective. But in this particular case, generally what I like to do is show the baseline, and then what do I want it to be? What do I want those levels of maturity to be over the next 2 to 3 years? And it doesn't always have to be a 5. There aren't many companies out there that need to have a 5 across the board, across the spider diagram. But it could be 3 to 3.5 might be suitable based on, again, your risk tolerance and the type of business that you're in and the likelihood of an attack, etc. But anyways, ISO 27001, there's some good tools available and resources to help you walk through that process of establishing that baseline. In the different companies that I've worked for, and Winnebago being one of them, I helped implement the enterprise risk management process, the heat maps, the mitigation plans, identifying our key strategic financial operating risks across the organization. And we included as a subset of that what our cybersecurity risks were, and then map them on a chart. And these are just representative positions on the chart. But based on the likelihood of that event happening and the impact on the organization, and certainly the likelihood and most certainly the impact are very much company dependent. We chose on the impact to talk about operating earnings. And so if a bad event happened, what would that cost to fix? And so again, I think just a best practice is integrating your cybersecurity plan into your overall enterprise risk management plan. Much like in the old days when we did disaster recovery and business continuity planning, it's important to have a proactive incident response plan so that when a bad thing does happen, and it will, that you have a plan already put together on the shelf, and you go and you pull the ransomware volume off the shelf and say, okay, what are the steps I need to follow? Who do I need to communicate with? When do I tell the board? Is it an event where I have to also disclose something to the SEC? I mean, there's just a variety of things that you have to do. I had put this together as a framework and had reviewed it with the Vice Admiral of the Navy responsible for all the nuclear missile programs, and he was the one thing he wanted to know is if a bad thing happened, when would he find out about it, and and how would he find out about it? And so we met several times to go through that with the Lockheed Martin, the partner that was working with us on the programs. But again, and even at Winnebago, we put an incident response plan together, again, so that you were ready in the event that a bad event took place. And then lastly, around tools, it's really like pick your favorite tool kind of thing. I've put down some samples. There are others that can be used, but it's something that you may want to consider getting some third-party help on, given the risk tolerance of your company, the threat vectors, the things that we've already talked about. What tools can supplement that cybersecurity program? One of my favorites being KnowBe4, which does enterprise security awareness training up front and then on an ongoing basis by sending out bogus spear phishing emails just to see how many employees are clicking on those links, and then send those people to additional training if they consistently click on the bad links. But there's a whole series of tools. And again, this is just a sample of the ones that I've used in the past, but there's a lot of other good ones as well. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Bruce Grant, the CEO of the SEs Group, who's going to wrap this all up in a tidy package for us.
Thanks a lot, Tim. Hi guys, I'm Bruce Grant, and I lead a technology company that's partnered with ExecHQ, and with a small cyber practice. We're not one of the big players, but we sort of came by it reluctantly. A large financial institution asked us, since we were doing some cyber defense for a DoD contractor, to help them, and it sort of grew from there. So Tim covered, first slide please, Jeff. Tim covered governance, and I'm not going to repeat too much of what these guys covered. They did a great job. Jeff covered best practices, including a lot of the action plan items. So I'm going to tell you some stories and connect the two together about ways to get this thing into a working, robust plan for yourself. And I'll go fairly quickly since I think the Q&A is most important. So why do you want to have a cyber plan? I've been thinking about this since I started putting the slides together, and mine aren't very graphic here, so I'll let you read the bullets. But I was thinking about the ERCOT, the Texas disaster, and started doing some of the math on it. And we often talk about how much reliability do you need? 5 nines, 4 nines, 3 nines, 2 nines. They were over 2 nines. They were down less than 1% of their time. And look at the 99% up, in other words, and look at the devastation of 70.5 hours out. Look at the fact that they were 4 minutes and 37 seconds away from their entire network being down for weeks or months. So I found that story very analogous to cyber defense. They didn't plan for the worst case scenario, and they got burned by it. So at 2 nines of threat, or 1% of openness of their downtime, look at the tremendous disaster. And it's very similar to cyber. As Jeff said, one bad guy gets in, excuse me, and you're pretty much nailed. So that was very interesting to me. With 8,000 hours, 8,700 hours in a year, they were down 70.5 hours. We talk about the low barrier, high reward. Well, if you were to look at something like a Porter's 5 Forces, there's no other business on the planet that has such a low barrier to entry with so much upside. And this landscape went crazy during the COVID. The tools got better, the access got easier, stronger enemy tools, and we didn't keep up. And it's cat and mouse, and the mouse is, as Tim said, in this type of asymmetric warfare that always favors the offense, the mouse is us. The weakest link for most of our organizations, though of course it wasn't the Solarwinds access point, is business email compromise. Besides the fact that they can get in through weak networks and credentials for your remote desktop, you've got a lot of weakness at the people. So we'll talk about that a lot. And it's interesting to note through InfraGard that the Office of Foreign Asset Control says you can't pay ransom in certain instances. You've got to check it out. So your lawyers, many good privacy law firms now have data breach counselors as a job description. These guys have to figure out whether or not to actually pay the bad guys and release Bitcoin and take 10% of the data and put it into a proof of life bucket and determine whether it's any good, and then negotiate the payments out. So who knew this was a new job description, right? So I think it's important, as Tim and Jeff said, that your enterprise risk management plan really determine your exposure and risk to each type of attack. We used to think of this as an IT problem. It used to be the good old days as we could run down to Best Buy and get a package and slap it on our computers and all was good. And those days are long gone. So every organization needs a cybersecurity officer, and your insurance agent and your lawyers are key players in understanding how to protect you. I like the FBI's sources of data, the InfraGard organization, without a U there. Many of you probably already know it or are members, but it's a great source for the private sector. Next slide, please, Jeff. So, one story I also wanted to tell you was about a financial institution that we were working with that was penetrated, and they were down for almost 3 days. And ask yourself, I think, as you're building this, what your own tolerance to risk is, and how your organization would not just survive being down for 3 days, your internal organization, but the impact to your customers. They lost a key customer because of that. So that really brought it home to me when I saw that level of risk. And not to mention the fact that my insurance prices almost tripled this year. So when you build the framework, you have to have an understanding of risk. Those spider diagrams, those heat maps, it really depends on your industry. You guys are financial mostly, but whether it's 27001 or NIST 800 or SOC 2 or the newer DoD CMMC framework for risk management, your compliance packages are now pretty automated. There's a lot of tools, as Jeff mentioned. You can buy a compliance package for your particular industry that builds out the templates, but many of you may have had the ones a few years ago where it was all raise your hand and it was attestation based. You basically said, sure, I change my password every 6 months and it's 15 characters or whatever the standards were, and you just raised your hand. And now almost all of these in most industries are audit based. It's a huge difference. You've got to be able to pass the audit. So you can't just breeze through those packages. They've gotten quite good. There's a lot of them out there. So you have to use them to focus in on certain focus areas and use strong automated tools. I'm not going to specifically recommend any today because it varies by the company and by the flavor of the month, but many of them have been out for a while and quite good. But you need strong automated tools in this asymmetric war because they're coming at you with very strong automated tools. You have to train. Users are always the most vulnerable target. Test your backups. People don't do this very often. It's one of the key points to make here as a tip is pull your backups off and test them in a separate sandbox to know whether they're clean. In part of your process ought to be able to have a clean backup running of the last quarter or something. Quarterly a ransomware test, perhaps an annual penetration test. You've got to find out if folks can get in. But a first step is always to talk to your ecosystem and figure out who your friends use and the experiences they've had, because many of them won't share the horror stories. They're embarrassed. They've done it in private. Unless it makes the cover of the journal or something, many groups will not talk about what their organization has been through, which is it is difficult to find out what caused the breach. So that's it. Next slide, please. So here, as we talk about the people, the processes, and the technology, you'll notice I left technology at the bottom because I just said to you, make sure your software is up to date, use automated tools, and move towards a zero trust model. What I mean by that is we used to say trust but verify, but now it's don't trust and then verify and verify again. So you have to have an expanded circle of trust outward from the workstation and the user, from the system, from your backups, etc. Everything has to be zero trust before it's trusted, and of course everything has to be up to date. But again, and the processes are important, that you have this automated framework, you build an enterprise risk management plan, and you consider it a board level responsibility. That scheduling is so critical because nobody woke up in the morning and say, wow, I can't wait to run a penetration test. It's challenging, difficult, and exposes weaknesses in your organization. So you have to force yourself to do it. But most importantly, the people. There's a lot of knowledge gained just by looking at what they can do. Jeff mentioned one great tool, KnowBe4, but there's lots of them out there that'll help train your people on cybersecurity. When you talk to your insurance agents, some of you may have done that this year and found that they were a lot more sophisticated in their questions this year than they were last year and the year before that, because now it's become such a big risk to them, and many companies have dropped cyber insurance, and the big guys like Beasley and others out of Lloyd's have gone up so much that the agents are much more sophisticated and come at you with a 30-page questionnaire now. So you learn a lot from that too. The changing compliance landscape, each of these frameworks that we talked about based on specific industries primarily is changing constantly. There's a board, there's a group that is changing that framework. You can't just say, well, I passed in early 2020, because that was the beginning of the COVID crisis. By the end, 27001 has changed significantly in less than a year. The people includes your partners and vendors. You have to have anyone that you're playing with and going to market on the same page. Many risks occur because subcontractors, for example, aren't held to the same high standards as the organization as a whole. So that's my. Let's go on to the next slide, please, Jeff. So lastly, we're going to talk about implementing the plan. It's really important that you're flexible and agile, that you can change platforms and partners. Every year you go out and look at new healthcare perhaps, or you shop for insurance, or whatever your annual functions are besides reporting. It's important to look at this as an annual event of perhaps a major change of players, because the threats, the actors, the technology changes so much. Not everyone has the ability to go out and contract with one of the big guys, but you've got to work with someone that it's not usually an internal function. Test your framework quarterly. Use objective criteria. It's nice that it's measurable, that this is not a subjective exercise. Don't let IT gets mad at me every time I say this, that you shouldn't let them lead the project. It is not an IT function. It's an enterprise level function. They need to participate and be a strong support player. Your leadership and boards must run and be aware of this quarterly level effect. So enterprise level issues require enterprise grade security solutions. I think that was the point that both Tim and Jeff made extremely well. Build a plan, test the plan, follow the plan. The other story I wanted to sort of finish with was it's interesting to note that the Solarwinds hack, we're all familiar with the story that December 13th, FireEye, Kim and Mandy and those guys founded in their organization, a $3.5 billion organization, and said, oh my God, we've been penetrated. And of course, since that time, 18,000 networks have been penetrated. That we only know the first level of the spider there of the 18,000 networks. It's gone much further, and it's still in there. Most government agencies, most of the high-tech companies, it sat for 9 months undetected. This asymmetric attack was a state-sponsored advanced persistent threat, to use the term, and allowed, without no phishing, came in through an update of SolarWinds software, but it's penetrated many places undetermined as of yet. There's speculation that that is sitting in many more computers that will come up at some point in the future, 6 months from the exposure date of December 13th, for example. So we don't know how badly we've been hurt entirely, but we know it's probably the greatest breach in history. So we simply have to be aware and plan for this. That woke us up a lot, but there'll be more of these. It's going to be more of the others. So don't let your organization be affected like ERCOT was and the folks in Texas, or the result of the SolarWinds hack. We find ways to build those walls, build a plan that'll keep you from that level of penetration, and life will be good. Don't try to understand that 3 to 5 days down really cripples most companies, and most ransomware attacks have that as a minimum time down now. With that, I'll go to the last slide. Thank you very much, and we'll let the audience ask any questions that they would like to ask. Thank you. Hello.
Yes, Bruce, thank you very much. That was a very excellent presentation. Now is the time for those in attendance, if you have questions of Jeff or Bruce or Tim, to type the question box in on the right-hand side of your screen. And again, we'll try to keep this to an hour, so we do have some time. Here's a question. Cyber insurance. Can you talk to the good, the bad, and the ugly about cyber insurance?
Since I brought it up, I think that's probably directed to me, though Jeff and guys, feel free. Yeah, many players dropped out last year, and some dropped out before because of the expanding COVID landscape, and then the big player Beasley came up with much tighter policies and such. So if you look at their form and what Lloyd's and others have done, it's gotten much more audit based. So as I mentioned, you've got to think about your risk and if you're going to survive an audit, much less an attack. So your rates. Now I'm in the business of providing cyber defense to others, so my rates probably, without any cause on our end, went up significantly this year, and I'm reading and hearing through my network and InfraGard and other places that it's going up significantly, and in some cases tripling. So the bad is that it's gotten very expensive. The good is they're getting much more knowledgeable about it. The fine print is that you have to look for what level of coverage that you're going to get, how many thousands, millions, whatever, for ransomware, for penetration, for denial of service, that type of thing. Hope that answers it.
Yeah, Bruce, this is another Bruce speaking, Bruce Lynn. Have you seen the coverages decline as the costs are going up? In other words, the insurance companies are less willing to out.
That's correct. That's correct, Bruce. They've definitely bounded their little fence a little tighter now in terms of your, for example, if you're not, if you're just attestation based, if you're just saying, and you're in the services business like me, and you haven't approved a SOC 2 audit, and you're raising your hand saying we're all good, they say, oh great, that's fine, that'll be double what I quoted you. But if you've passed your audit by a outside compliance organization, your rate is Y. Does that help?
Sure. No, I think that's good. Here's another question. Are there industry groups that I could join to keep up to date on the issues as this whole environment changes?
Great question. The number one group I'd recommend all of you, if you don't know who InfraGard is, the FBI put this together before 9/11, but since 9/11, it's just expanded tremendously. It's the FBI's public-private partnership, confidential level stuff. You can apply to infragard.org, GARD.org. Every organization that is at risk should have their security officer as a member of InfraGard, because you're getting the latest updates from your Department of Justice, FBI. Director Ray spoke a while back. We've got new plans in cybersecurity, and it's segmented by your industry type. So there's a large group that just focuses on the financial services industry and financial industry, Bruce. So I would Jeff, Tim, other organizations. There's always lots of separate organizations associated with the compliance frameworks as well, but InfraGard would be the number one that I'd recommend.
Here's another question. How do we know good when we see it? In other words, what measures exist to assess the quality of an organization's security posture?
Well, I think this is Jeff Kabaki. I think that was one of the reasons I was talking about, for example, the ISO 27001 framework that has, 14 controls and 14 security domains and 114 controls. And you can measure and have a third party actually come in and measure your maturity level. Now, the board's going to say, okay, how do I know a 3.4 is good enough? And so it goes back to that enterprise risk management heat map that says, okay, if you can show over time that you have reduced the likelihood of a bad thing happening and reduced the impact, what I have found historically is the board, the boards and the management teams appreciate that kind of transparency.
Okay, here's another question here. This is sort of a scenario. You find out your system has been penetrated, ransom note displayed on point of entry PC, files are locked. What are the best next steps or remediation options?
Jeff, you want to go, or Tim? Either one. So.
Well, I was going to say there are, even before that happens, there are companies out there that do ransomware assessments and look at your entire infrastructure and applications and everything, and give, very cost effectively can give you a score on, what's our likelihood of suffering a ransomware attack. What I would do, let's say you do all of that, but you still get a ransomware attack, is then I'd go to my ransomware incident response plan and say, okay, my first step is I need to notify, if I have cyber insurance, I'm going to notify the insurance provider, right? I'm going to update the CEO and the management team. Within a certain amount of time, I'm going to update the board of directors if you have a board. And so again, that whole playbook, you want to have all mapped out in your incident response plan, so that when your hair's on fire and people are starting to get locked out of the systems, you're going, oh my God, what do I do next? So I think that's why being proactive in that case, and it's not an easy thing to do. There are companies that, again, cost effectively help you build those plans. I've used them in the past myself, and you know, that gave me the ability to sleep a little bit better at night, knowing that I had those plans ready to go.
Yeah, I'm wondering, I'm going to read into the question here, and maybe Tony, if you're listening, you can correct me here, but I think maybe one of his questions here is, now that I've, forgotten to do all these things, do I pay the ransom or not?
That's a multi-part question. It again, depending upon the industry and the level of risk, and if the intellectual property is of national security, to some of Jeff's and Tim's discussions, or it's of industrial security, and what is being asked for, what is being shown as valid data. Again, my recommendation is if you've got a valid backup from that you've tested from some period before, since many attacks sit on your system for 6 months, test the one from 3 months back, test the one from 6 months back. Obviously, you've got to know how much you're at risk, and that's one function. Then, does the penetrator provide a valid proof of life of some of your data? Do they have it? Can they restore it? The answer is, if you don't have if you're mission critical, if your company is not going to run without that data, and your backups are infected and you are completely down, you have little choice but to start negotiating, which is why this is such a successful business.
Yeah, well, I guess, that's, thank you. All right, we have a few more questions. Go ahead.
I'd like to add a little bit to that. A lot of this is, as Jeff was saying, it's in your preparation. So as you put together your architecture, you can choose architectures that protect to various levels of degree different aspects of your system and your networks, so that if some networks get penetrated and taken down by ransomware, it's not the crown jewels. And if you do that in a robust faction, you may not be in a position where everything goes down all at once. So there's some things like that you can take advantage of with good planning. And again, get your architecture designed well, get some smart people working on that, so that you can protect the things that are most important, so that you don't lose them. And then you can, to the extent that your corporate data that's most sensitive is protected, then it's an easier decision on the ransomware when they penetrate and get access to the outer lobby, if you will, of your system.
Mm-hmm. Do you know, just a follow-up question to that, do you know if there are companies that have been successful in unlocking files that have been encrypted via ransomware attacks?
Without paying the ransom?
I think that is the implication, yes. In other words,
Yeah.
You tell the guy to go away because you'll unlock it yourself. It's sort of the analogy is the iPhone that Apple would not unlock, but the FBI would manage to do it.
I have not heard of anyone being successful in doing that. I don't know about you, Bruce.
No, Jeff, I agree with you. It's like again, the advantage goes to the bad guys here, and a slight tweak in their algorithm of how they've locked it in, and you're not going to unlock it without that key.
Yeah, I know that some of this stuff has been done as a post-mortem, but the time that it takes to figure out what happened and to unlock it, if you will, is far longer than you can accept from a business perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, it has been done, but it's done more in an academic sense after the fact. It's not, and it takes months. So it's not something that I've ever heard of anybody actually doing it to the extent that they can just say, well, we can ignore the ransom.
Sort of like bringing the dead back to life, I guess.
Yeah.
But then we've seen a TV show about what happens when you have people who are the Walking Dead too. Here's another question, and we got a few more minutes here. I know we're going over, so I apologize for anybody who has to leave. Please feel free to leave. These questions will be recorded, and you will get a link to the recording in the next day or so. But for those of you who are still around, again, I hope Jeff, Tim, Bruce, you have a few more minutes.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay. Here's a question. Here's a person who's wants to change careers into cybersecurity. What advice do you have in becoming a candidate for being hired into the field of cybersecurity?
Well, the degrees are out there now at many of the IT oriented universities. Getting up for a journeyman to come up from, say, systems administration or developer into it, however, that has already been in IT for a long time, then I believe that moving towards the CISSP Certified Information Security Professional type model is a good framework to explore to see if they can be there, because it's at a baseline. You need to know that the people that are representing you in IT have passed that level of certification. So I think that's a good. So either the academic route or the sort of trade route, or both would be my answer. Jeff, Tim.
No, good answer. I put a lot of weight on those certifications, and whoever's thinking about doing that, I think it's a great idea. One of the things you may want to do is get a mentor who's perhaps already a chief information security officer who kind of came up through the ranks. You know, those type of people are very willing to share their knowledge. There's some great people that come out of the FBI. I've hired some of them over in the past to help do investigations when I needed that kind of work. But no, it's a great, I think an up and coming career path that you know, we have a shortage of people that are following.
Okay, last question here, because I know we're running a little bit over here. So last question has to do with a comment that was made earlier about cybersecurity not being solely IT's responsibility. What governance model is most effective in assigning the IT the cybersecurity responsibility? Should the CE own it, or the CRO? What approach would you recommend?
Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, well, again, I think it has to be visibly owned by the highest person in the organization, depending upon the size of the organization. The COO, the CEO, the chairman of the board, they all have to be engaged and open to it and sending clear messages that it's important. So I mean, clearly there has to be a staff structure involved to actually do the legwork and so forth. But I think from a visibility perspective, I think it's the highest leadership in the organization has to be clearly engaged and actively involved.
There's some really good information on the National Association of Corporate Directors website. So if you're not already a member there, that might be worth following up on. But they have very specific information about the roles and responsibilities of the board, because it is a core job responsibility now. It's not just something that you report on once in a while. So that's a great source. I think internal audit is a good place to have someone lead it. We had that at one of the companies that I worked at. They had the entire enterprise risk management program, ethics and compliance, you know, that type of thing. Certainly IT will have a chief information security officer that has the tools and will write the policies and those types of things. But you know, it's nice. It was nice having the VP of Internal Audit actually, you know, kind of frame up the conversation with the board, and then I would give the details of specifically what actions we had taken that quarter and what was coming down the road. But definitely a partnership, I think, between the head of IT and the CFO and internal audit.
Well, and the CEOs of these companies, head of Microsoft was saying on 60 Minutes 2 weeks ago, he didn't know he was breached until after he was breached. It was sitting around in they were in his systems for all these months ahead of time. All of these, so obviously, a C-level, CEO level. Think about that ERCOT story again. Don't you think that utility would have liked to have known that 1% of risk or downtime would have generated this type of a disaster? So I think we've kind of demonstrated that is clearly a top level CEO level risk.
Okay, here's the last question.
There's two different dimensions to that question. The first dimension is who needs to be engaged to make sure that everybody in the organization takes it seriously. And to me, that's the top person in the organization, the CEO, the board, so forth and so on. Then the second question is who needs to be engaged to make sure that all the right technologies are in place, the right architectures are in place, and that's more of a technical lead that would involve the different players and a layer below that, the CEO or the board chairman. So I think it's a two-dimensional question, depending upon exactly what you're looking for.
You know, that would go back to the idea that you want a good plan well executed.
Right.
As opposed to a bad plan poorly executed. That's just the opposite corner of that quadrant.
Yeah.
The last question here, is there a source for a model policy on cybersecurity? A template?
A model policy, meaning an insurance policy?
No, a cybersecurity policy.
Cybersecurity policy. Okay, Tim, what do you think?
I don't know if there's a single source. They're mostly tailored to the organizations. So I don't know if there's a generic source that you can find. I don't know of any off the top of my head. Again, if you go to these standards organizations like the DoD has a CMMI and there's ISO 9, these different things, they have actually, those templates are in a sense a model that you could follow. But again, that all has to be tailored to your organization.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it really all starts with the information security policy. That's kind of the overarching governing document that, you know, talks about data classification and the types of data we want to protect and what your responsibilities are and acceptable use types of things. And so, and there are, you know, if you search the web, you can get examples of those, but clearly it's going to need some customization to make it applicable to your company.
You're correct, Jeff. I'm looking at 27, I'm searching now, looking at 27001 compliance. There's lots of sample. All these folks want to sell you some services, so all the compliance companies come up on the first page and they give you a taste of what the policy is going to look like by showing you their framework that they want to get you into and sell. And so, you know, you can just simply search for that based on the framework that you're going to adopt in your industry, if it's 27001 or CMMC or whatever.
Okay, all right. Well, we've sort of gone past our magic hour, but there have been a lot of questions, so I wanted to make sure we got them all in. So at this time, I am going to end the webinar. And again, my thanks to Tim and Jeff and Bruce for, I think, an excellent presentation. A lot of meat here. And so for those who are left, yes, you will get a copy of the slides, and the video will be available very shortly. So I thank everyone, and I'm sure this is not going to be the last word on cybersecurity. So we can maybe look forward to to updating this sometime in the near future.
Thanks,
And
everybody.
well, thank
Thank
you.
Thanks for having us, Bruce. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. So with that, we're going to end the webinar, and we'll talk with you all next time. Thank you.